General Vaklu of Onderon was a prominent and celebrated figure, a man whose leadership and resolve shaped much of Onderon's tumultuous history. His legacy, however, is forever marred by the eventual corruption that the Sith sowed within him, turning a respected leader into a tool of darkness and chaos. To understand Vaklu's rise and fall, one must first examine the man himself. A staunch nationalist, a decorated warrior, and a leader who believed that Onderon could and should become independent of the Republic's influence. Vaklu, in his early years, was defined by his strength of conviction and military acumen, but as with so many leaders of his kind, it was this very ambition that made him susceptible to the Sith's manipulations. Onderon, a rugged and often war-torn planet, was no stranger to conflict. Positioned within the Inner Rim, its strategic importance was significant, and Vaklu rose to prominence during a time when Onderon was experiencing mounting tensions with the Galactic Republic. For centuries, Onderon had maintained a delicate balance between its independence and its role within the Republic. The population, however, was deeply divided. Some sought greater unity with Coruscant, seeing the Republic as a force for peace and stability, while others, led by figures like Vaklu, believed the Republic had overstayed its welcome, meddling in affairs that should have been Onderon's alone to decide. Vaklu was a man of the people, admired for his military victories and his ability to speak with authority and clarity. He earned his stripes as a general in Onderon's defense forces, where his decisive leadership protected the planet from numerous threats, including the feral beasts of Zun and the pirates who plagued the skies. His victories earned him not only the loyalty of his soldiers but also the support of a growing nationalist movement. To many Onderonians, Vaklu embodied strength and independence, qualities they felt the Republic lacked. The corruption they saw in Coruscant's bureaucracy only deepened this sentiment. Vaklu's rhetoric became increasingly focused on Onderon's sovereignty. He painted the Republic as a distant, self-interested power, far removed from the realities of life on Onderon. He warned that the Republic's influence was like a shadow creeping across the planet, smothering its people and culture. While his words resonated with many, they also sowed seeds of division. Queen Talia, the rightful ruler of Onderon and Vaklu's cousin, found herself in direct opposition to Vaklu's growing faction. Talia remained a loyalist, believing that Onderon's ties to the Republic were crucial for stability and prosperity. This rift set the stage for a bitter political and military conflict that would eventually engulf the planet. The Sith, as they often did, recognized opportunity amidst chaos. They observed Vaklu's ambitions and saw in him a means to further their own ends. At this point, the galaxy was still reeling from the aftermath of the Jedi Civil War, and the Sith were intent on exploiting every fracture they could find. Onderon was an ideal target. A divided world, a charismatic leader with nationalist fervor, and an already fragile relationship with the Republic. Vaklu, despite his strengths, was a man driven by his ideals to the point of obsession. He saw himself as the savior of Onderon, the one who would free his people from the Republic's yoke. It was this blind dedication that made him vulnerable. The Sith began to subtly manipulate Vaklu, feeding his growing disdain for Queen Talia and the Republic. At first, their influence was barely noticeable. Vaklu's speeches became more impassioned, his strategies more aggressive, but he still believed he was acting of his own accord. The Sith, however, understood the power of ideology, and they whispered into Vaklu's ear, reinforcing his worst fears and encouraging his most radical ambitions. They convinced him that Queen Talia was weak, a puppet of Coruscant who cared more for the Republic's approval than for Onderon's future. They presented themselves as allies, promising Vaklu the strength and support he needed to secure Onderon's independence. It was not long before Vaklu's campaign escalated into open rebellion. His forces, bolstered by Sith-backed mercenaries and shadowy operatives, began a coordinated effort to overthrow Talia's rule. Cities became battlegrounds, and Onderon's people were forced to choose sides. Vaklu portrayed his war as a fight for liberation, a struggle to reclaim Onderon's dignity and self-determination. Yet beneath this patriotic facade, the Sith's influence continued to grow. They urged Vaklu to take increasingly ruthless actions, whispering that sacrifices had to be made for the greater good. Executions of dissenters, brutal crackdowns on loyalist territories, and manipulative propaganda became tools of Vaklu's regime. The man who had once been seen as Onderon's hero was becoming something darker, though many failed to see it at first. The deeper Vaklu fell under the Sith's sway, the more his sense of honor and morality eroded. What had started as a righteous cause was being twisted into a pursuit of power. Vaklu justified his actions as necessary, arguing that the ends would vindicate the means. The Sith, of course, encouraged this line of thinking. They assured Vaklu that once Onderon was freed, he would be remembered as a hero and a visionary. But the truth was far more sinister. The Sith had no interest in Onderon's freedom or Vaklu's legacy. Their only goal was to destabilize the planet and sow discord, leaving it vulnerable to their greater machinations. As the conflict escalated, Queen Talia's forces, supported by Jedi and Loyalist allies, fought to regain control of the planet. The war was devastating. Onderon's cities were scarred by battle, its people divided and weary. Vaklu's forces fought with fanaticism, their loyalty to him unshakable even as his actions became increasingly brutal. By this point, Vaklu was fully under the Sith's influence, though whether he realized it or not is a matter of debate. Some argue that Vaklu believed he was still acting in Onderon's best interests, unable to see how far he had fallen. Others suggest that he knew he was being manipulated but chose to accept the Sith's help, believing he could outmaneuver them once Onderon was his. The turning point came during the Siege of Izais, Onderon's capital. Queen Talia, with the aid of Jedi who sought to end the Sith's influence, launched a final assault to reclaim her throne. The battle was fierce, and Vaklu's forces fought with desperation, knowing that defeat would mean the end of their cause. Vaklu himself remained defiant, refusing to surrender even as his position became untenable. To him, the battle was not just for Onderon. It was for his vision of its future, a vision he believed was worth any cost. It was during this final confrontation that the full extent of the Sith's corruption became apparent. As the Jedi confronted Vaklu, they revealed the truth of his Sith alliances, exposing how he had been manipulated and how his rebellion had played directly into the hands of those who sought to destroy Onderon, not save it. Vaklu's reaction is a subject of much speculation. Some accounts suggest that he was shocked, perhaps even momentarily remorseful, as the realization of what he had become set in. Others claim he doubled down, refusing to accept the truth and accusing the Jedi of spreading lies to undermine him. Vaklu's forces were ultimately defeated, and he was taken into custody. Queen Talia reclaimed her throne, and Onderon began the long process of rebuilding. Vaklu's legacy, however, remained a complex and divisive one. To his supporters, he was a hero who had fought for Onderon's freedom, a man whose only crime was trusting the wrong allies. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a leader whose ambition and pride led him to betray his own people, becoming a pawn of the very forces he claimed to oppose. The tragedy of General Vaklu lies in the fine line he walked between hero and villain. He was a man of vision and resolve, qualities that made him a natural leader but also left him vulnerable to corruption. The Sith understood this, exploiting his fears, his ambitions, and his deep-seated distrust of the Republic. They turned his strengths into weaknesses, using him as a tool to further their own agenda. In the end, Vaklu's downfall was not just a personal tragedy but a reflection of how even the noblest causes can be perverted when ambition outweighs wisdom. Underneath it all, one cannot help but wonder whether Vaklu truly believed he was acting for Onderon's good until the very end. His legacy endures, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the seductive power of ambition and the dangers of those who would exploit it. General Vaklu's defeat at the hands of Queen Talia and her Jedi allies marked the climax of a bitter struggle that had torn Onderon apart. The Siege of Izais, brutal and unforgiving, brought years of escalating tension to an end. Yet the scars it left, both physical and political, would remain for decades. Vaklu, once seen as a paragon of Onderonian strength, was brought low not by his enemies, but by the very ideals that had once defined him. The Sith, ever the architects of corruption, had twisted his vision into something unrecognizable, and in doing so ensured his downfall. Vaklu's capture was a spectacle, but his final days were shrouded in ambiguity. Many reports claim he remained defiant until the end, refusing to accept responsibility for the devastation he had caused. He denounced Queen Talia as a puppet of Coruscant and branded her Jedi allies as interlopers with no place in Onderon's affairs. In Vaklu's eyes, his rebellion had not been a betrayal but a necessity, an act of liberation for a planet oppressed by distant powers. Whether this was genuine conviction or the delusion of a man unwilling to face the consequences of his choices remains a point of debate. Some sources suggest that, in private, Vaklu was forced to confront the truth of the Sith's manipulation, though whether he accepted it or not is unknown. Onderon, meanwhile, began the arduous process of rebuilding. Queen Talia's reign was marked by efforts to restore stability and heal the divisions Vaklu's rebellion had caused. Her decision to show mercy to many of Vaklu's supporters, rather than seek vengeance, was seen as an attempt to reunite the planet. However, Vaklu himself was shown no such clemency. His fate was sealed the moment he refused to renounce his rebellion. Though his public trial was brief, its impact was profound. Vaklu's supporters continued to view him as a martyr, a man who had dared to challenge the status quo and had paid the ultimate price. To others, he was a traitor who had sold Onderon's future to the Sith in his pursuit of power. The Sith's role in Vaklu's corruption became a matter of intense scrutiny. The Jedi Order, still recovering from the aftermath of the Jedi Civil War, worked tirelessly to root out lingering Sith influence across the galaxy. Onderon, seen as a key example of how the Sith could exploit political unrest, became a focal point in these efforts. Jedi scholars and historians examined Vaklu's downfall as a case study in manipulation, illustrating how the Sith thrived on division and chaos. Vaklu's story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how even the most steadfast leaders could fall prey to their own ambitions when guided by dark influences. Yet Vaklu's legacy remained deeply polarizing. On Onderon, his supporters refused to let his name be forgotten. They spoke of him as a visionary leader who had fought for Onderon's independence, a man whose only mistake was trusting the wrong allies. This narrative gained traction among those who felt alienated by Queen Talia's rule, particularly in the years following the conflict. To these Onderonians, Vaklu's defeat represented the Republic's triumph over their sovereignty, a bitter pill that many were unwilling to swallow. They blamed the Jedi and Coruscant for meddling in Onderon's affairs, insisting that Vaklu's rebellion had been a justified struggle for freedom. The truth of Vaklu's motivations, however, is far more complex. His early actions were undeniably driven by a genuine desire to see Onderon thrive as an independent and powerful world. His distrust of the Republic was not without merit. Corruption within Coruscant's bureaucracy was an open secret, and Onderon's unique position as a strategically important world often left it vulnerable to exploitation. Vaklu's nationalism, in its purest form, was not inherently destructive. What doomed him was his inability to see the line between ambition and obsession, between leadership and tyranny. The Sith exploited his fervor, turning his noble cause into a vehicle for their own dark purposes. By the time Vaklu realized how far he had fallen, it was too late. Vaklu's rise and fall serve as a grim parable of how ideals, when left unchecked, can become weapons of destruction. The Sith understood this better than anyone, and their manipulation of Vaklu was both subtle and masterful. They did not force his hand. They simply amplified his fears and ambitions, whispering promises of strength and victory until Vaklu believed their lies were his own thoughts. This is the tragedy of his corruption. Vaklu was not inherently evil, nor was he a willing servant of the Sith. He was a man consumed by his vision, blind to the forces that were shaping his destiny. In the end, Vaklu's rebellion failed not because his ideals lacked merit, but because they were tainted by the Sith's influence. Onderon's independence, the very cause he fought for, was undermined by the chaos and destruction his actions had wrought. The people of Onderon paid the price for his ambition, their cities shattered and their unity broken. Queen Talia's rule, while bringing stability, could not erase the divisions that Vaklu's rebellion had deepened. For years to come, Onderon would remain a planet haunted by the memory of its civil war and the leader who had once been its greatest hope. Vaklu's story endures as both a cautionary tale and a point of contention. To some, he is a tragic figure, a leader undone by forces beyond his control. To others, he is a villain, a man whose pride and ambition led him to betray his planet. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. General Vaklu was a product of his time, a warrior and a patriot whose strength became his greatest weakness. The Sith may have planted the seeds of his downfall, but it was Vaklu's own choices that allowed them to take root. In the end, the name Vaklu remains etched into Onderon's history as a symbol of both its greatest potential and its darkest hour. His life serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the insidious power of the Sith. Onderon, for all its resilience, learned this lesson at great cost, and the echoes of Vaklu's rebellion would linger long after his name had faded from the galaxy's memory.